Hi everyone, my name is Demi. Welcome to Let's Have Tea. For those of you who don't know, Let's Have Tea is my channel about everything. And I'm serious, it's totally random. So you can come here and find anything. And today I want to tell you a story that is somewhat connected to the TB Joshua documentary that is playing out on BBC. For those of you who don't know, TB Joshua was a very popular pastor in Nigeria who was known for miracles, basically. Like, he had a TV channel called Emmanuel TV, and it was just video after video after video of miracles. Okay, like the dead are waking up, people are being healed, like the crippled are running around, those kinds of miracles. And a lot of people were captivated by TB Joshua for quite some time. And I will say that when I was younger, I recall that almost every salon I went to get my hair done was very like, the TVs was very like Emmanuel TV, that's all we're watching. Okay. Because he sort of spoke to the sense of you can show up and God can choose you and you can have a miracle. Now, in case you're like waiting for some juicy announcement about how I went to TB Joshua's church, that's not it. My family and I have never been to TB Joshua's church. But what we did experience was something that would have become a dangerous cult. Like, in my opinion, my siblings might say otherwise, but in my opinion, it would have become that. And I will tell you why I think so. And just to clear the air, the reason why I'm sharing this story is not because I'm trying to create sensationalism in any way. It's because I feel like a lot of people really need to hear what it means to be in a cult, number one, and to also understand that they might be in one, okay? Like, you might be in a cult. And it's okay to admit that to yourself, because there is so much denial. Like, when I'm talking to people and they're telling me certain things about the religious houses that they attend, and I'm like, that's sounding very dangerous, they get upset. And they assume that I don't know where they're coming from. So it's one of those, Demi's just trying to discourage my faith. I do not want to discourage anybody's faith in God, because I can't, to be honest. I can't dare do that. But I do want you to be aware of the fact that there are some religious places that are not designed for the edification of your spirit. These places are designed for the glory of whoever the pastor is. And I need more people to know this, okay? And I'll tell you why I'm saying this. I'll share the story of my family with you. So, that when I was young, we attended a very big church in Nigeria, in Lagos. I am not going to mention the churches, and I will anonymize the pastors and all the people in this story as much as possible. Lord help me, because I know that when I tell a story like this, a name is bound to slip. So if I don't mention any names by the end of this, I am applauding myself, because I'm recording this in one take. I'm not doing any like hectic edits or anything. I'm just going to cut off the beginning where I was like sipping my tea before I got started and putting on my lip gloss because my lips get really dry. Thank you, iron deficiency. Anywho, so let's get into it. So we attended this really big church in Lagos. This church is well known. It has a lot of branches around Nigeria. And it was a great church. Like, it was one of those where I was a child and I was allowed to be a child. Like, when my parents got to church, they took me to Sunday school. They took my sister to Sunday school, my younger brother. You know, like, we all just went to Sunday school and we had our own service separate from whatever the adults were doing. And I remember church would typically close like early afternoon and we'd all just go home. And that was it. I think there was like a weekday service that you would attend if you felt like it, like, or if you had the time to go. It wasn't one of those like you must do it. So it was that kind of church. It was very chill. A lot of people we met there were like-minded people that we really liked, and they were like family friends. So it was really great. But after a while, something happened with the leadership of the church. And I don't know, but there was some sort of big falling out. And my dad was like, yeah, he feels uncomfortable because he was close to the leadership. He feels uncomfortable with this. He doesn't want to go to this church anymore. We are changing churches. And so we changed churches. And obviously, man had a plan. Yeah, he was like, there's this pastor, we'll call him Pastor A, who has started a church. It's a small church, but this man is spirit filled and he really dwells on the word. Now, maybe first, let's just take this as our first pit stop in a way. There is a certain belief among some people that the bigger the church, the likelihood it has lost its vision, which is very possible. But that doesn't mean that small churches are any better, okay? Because that small church is trying to become the big church that you left behind. So I'll continue with my story. So we started to attend Pastor A's church. Pastor A's church was in his apartment, okay? Pastor A was married. He had, I believe, 4 kids. Yes, he had 4 kids. I'm not going to mention their names, but he had 4 kids. And yeah, the church was in his living room. So he didn't have living room furniture. It was set up like, a pulpit and a pew style, but obviously very small. And we had these plastic chairs that we used. And it was like at the top floor, that sort of thing. It was in a very, very, I don't like what you would call the trenches. And I'm not kidding. It was in the trenchy area of Lagos. But again, when you're seeking the Lord, you don't look at all of those things. You just go to church. And I still support that. So we were going there. It was great, but it was very intense. It was one of those places where we were no longer allowed to be kids because there was no Sunday school for us to go to. It was just that one place. So we got to see what an adult church was like. And the adult church was very, again, I will use this word, intense. Like it was very spiritual in that church. People would have these trances, trance-like states, and they would see visions about the future and just point out who's got an evil spirit. It was that place. So when people are oh, the TP Joshua thing seems exaggerated, I'm no, not really. It was that kind of place. And it was just one of those things that captivated you and made you feel like, oh, wow, I'm seeing God for the first time. And obviously, as a child, we were all captivated. The interesting thing, I think now that I still ponder over, is that my siblings and I were put in the choir. Now, the gift of singing does not exist in my family, okay? I don't know how to sing to save my life. I don't know about my sister. Maybe she'll speak for herself. I know how to sing to save my life. My brother is actually good. I think he can sing and he can beat drums. He's actually good. But I do not consider myself a singer. But we were put in the choir. And I'll tell you how wild the reason for this was later. We were put in the choir and it was just that jazz. Now, the building we were in, again, was in a very, very weird part of Lagos. And it was one of those buildings that was beginning to tilt because the foundation wasn't right. So we had to move out. So that meant Pastor A and his family moved because we were using their house as the church. So we moved and they moved to another area. And I remember the whole time this was happening, Pastor A had begun to share a vision with us of what the Lord was telling him. And this vision was that he would go on to build one of the biggest churches in Nigeria, and it would have a school and it would have a theological college and it would have a university. It was that whole vibe, which is very typical of a lot of pastors in Nigeria. If you follow them, you would realize some of the big brand names have a university, a high school, that sort of thing. And the idea is that they are propagating the word of the Lord through all of these places. So he also had the same vision. And he had shared that with us. I remember even going into his office once and he had a cardboard. Man's not an architect, yeah, but he had drawn blocks of different things on the board to say, yes, this is what the vision would look like. So everybody bought into this. Again, when you're in a small community like that, you sort of bond with everybody really quickly. And some of the people who joined the church with us were people who my dad already knew from the previous church. So there was that sense of community, and it was we were doing something great. And I just want to pause here. Let's call this pit stop number 2 to tell you that one of the ways that you can easily get drawn into a cult is if the cult is able to instill the belief in you that you are doing something that others are unable to do or are too weak to do, like you're buying into this grand vision, which to be honest is sort of like what life is anyway. Like you buy into a grand vision for the most part with your work, with whatever you do. But like becoming a cult member, like that's something that might, it's like, yeah, you're buying into this thing. God is leading us here. And if we do this, then we will be successful and we will be better than these other people. So part of like joining a cult and staying on is the belief that you think you will do better than people who are not in that cult. Moving on. So we moved to a different place. And when we were moving, there started to come out of the spiritual messages, this sense of like, we should compare ourselves to the Israelites. We are like the Israelites. The Israelites suffered a lot. They were in Goshen for a while in Egypt as a part of Egypt. So we should consider ourselves to be like them. So in our heads, there was this sense of like, oh, we're like the Israelites. And the vision started to say things like, we are going to a promised land. I'm pausing to just think about this because I'm like, that was so wild. They're like, we are going to a promised land. And this is a land that we will get for free. There's no land that is free in Nigeria. Just by the way, like families in Nigeria own land. You've got to buy it from them. Or maybe they can give it to you if they really believe in your vision. But I'll tell you the story about this. So we should think of ourselves as the Israelites. Anywho, so we moved again into an apartment. But this time, the apartment we moved into had the landlord of the building. So it was a 2-story apartment. The pastor and his family, I think, lived downstairs. And the landlord lived upstairs. So it was 2 flats. This landlord did not believe in God. I can't remember if it's that he didn't believe in God or if he was of a different religion. It's one of the two, but I can't remember correctly. Because again, I was a child, but I still remember some parts of the story. But he didn't believe in God. So sometimes during the service, while we were like singing, clapping, beating drums, this man would literally come downstairs and chase all of us outside. He would chase us out. I'm not kidding. So they started to call him Pharaoh. And I hope that sounds familiar because Pharaoh in the Bible, the Egyptian Pharaoh, they started to call him that. And the idea was he is an obstacle to the children of God who want to serve the Lord. So I will start calling him Pharaoh because I never learned his real name. So Pharaoh would come and chase us out. And sometimes when he came, he would come during night vigils. So I don't know if I mentioned this already, but we had services in this church that were, again, intense on Sundays. Sunday church service would start at like 8 o'clock in the morning and it would go on until afternoon, evening. So it was like long services because people would be in a trance and there'd be like multiple visions. I just hit my mic. I hope that doesn't transmit. But there'd be like multiple visions and like all these things. It was intense. Then there was vigil every Friday. And vigil every Friday started at 12 midnight and sometimes went on until 5 a.m. Now, remember when I said as children, we were not allowed to be children in this new place because there was no room for it? Sometimes in those vigils, they would not let us sleep. They would literally tell us to stay awake. And whenever you slept, they would come and wake you up. We were kids. So there was that. And then there was also midweek service on Wednesdays. So it was Wednesday, Friday, Saturday. The other church was like Sundays. If you've got time on a Wednesday, we have something going on. There was no every week. There's a night vigil. We're praying down evil spirits, whatever. There wasn't that. But with this one, there was. So back to Pharaoh. Sometimes when Pharaoh came to chase us out of the apartment, it would be raining outside and it would be like in a night vigil. So Pharaoh was very strategic. I'll give that to him. He would like choose a vigil because he hardly came to chase us out on a Sunday that I can remember. It was usually like during vigil and when it was raining. And the only option was to go across the road. So Pharaoh's house was here. And then we would go across the road to an incomplete building that didn't have a roof over it, had nothing. But the floor, like the ground in front of it was clear. Like there were no weeds or anything. And we would just set up there, standing there in the rain. and people would be clapping and praying. And the belief was that doing this was shaming Pharaoh. I don't know if Pharaoh was if Pharaoh was ashamed, because to be honest, I think we were just getting ourselves sick. But we would be there, and the kids, like, I mean, obviously, parents would do what's best for their kids in that situation. So we used to like be put in like a corner that had a little bit of shelter, and there was like a sleeping bag where we could just sleep. But for the most part, people were out in the rain clapping. And this man was just saying, this is how Pharaoh treated the Israelites when they were in Goshen. And so we are being mistreated. We will get to our promised land. We will put Pharaoh to shame. And I now think that Pharaoh was mentally unstable, because sometimes he would come and he would say, oh, he's repenting. He's really sorry for disgracing the house of the Lord, and he wants to repent. And they would pray for him, and they would say he's repented. He would even join us in the service, and he would clap. And then by 2 weeks' time, he's like, get out. I don't want to hear your noise in the middle of the night. I don't want to hear it on a Sunday morning. I don't want to hear it at all. So there was all that going on. And the belief again was still like, yeah, this is part of it. We're going to the promised land. So eventually they moved from Pharaoh's house and moved to a different residence. And now at this residence, they said they were being confronted. I don't know how true it was. They were being confronted by a cult that was supposed to be like an evil cult. So I don't know if you people know what they call like Babalawo in Nigeria, but people tend to like relate Babalawo to a bad thing. So they don't see it as like a herbal, like a medicine doctor, like I don't know how to explain it, but you catch my drift. They don't see it as a herbal doctor. It's more like Babalawo is like an evil thing. So they were being confronted by those, and it was always like, yeah, we're going to the promised land, whatever. Anyway, at this new location, we started to hear that the promised land had been identified, and we had to start going there to pray. So we would all go in a bus, and this bus was the staff bus of a company one of the members worked at. And I don't think they knew that he was bringing the bus to the church to transport people around, but he was doing it anyway. So he would do that, and we would go to this land, and we were very few, but it was like this vast land. And the sense was that we should just all stand here and we should pray. And if we pray here, this is the land God has already said belongs to us. I am very thankful that we never got arrested on that land, because it turned out that the land belonged to a powerful family, and we had no business being there at all. No, when I say no business, we had no business being there. But we were there, we were always praying until I think they sent a warning or something along those lines. But we were lucky to not have been arrested. Still, the story went on that we are a chosen people. We are the ones who will do a great thing. We are building a great church, and we will have a promised land. So we were here in this place, and lots of interesting things started to happen. For instance, the pastor's daughter said that she went to school and she caught 3 witches in her class. And the idea of this was to say that the pastor's daughter was highly evolved spiritually, that she could sense when other children had some sort of witchcraft in them. And this was a big thing at the church. Now, because of the way the church was set up, there was a lot of respect. I want to use that word. There was a lot of respect, or maybe respect is not the word. There was a lot of reverence for people who had either the gift of like going into trance and seeing visions, or people like the pastor's daughter was like, I caught 3 witches in school. And the idea is we should all try to like also catch witches. But what was weird was that people would go into trance and they would speak in foreign languages, in tongues. I don't know how to speak in tongues, by the way, if anyone is wondering, I don't. And I always find it interesting when people are like, if you can't speak in tongues, you're not praying enough, because I'm like, yeah, what exactly are you saying? Because I don't understand. But anyway, let's not go there, because this is not me attacking anyone's religious beliefs. I'm just telling you all a story. So there was a lot of reverence for people. So people would go into trance, they would speak in tongues, and there were specific tongues that were attached to specific people. Like they spoke in a certain way, or they said certain words that sort of like they had, I don't want to say they had like taken over the IP of those words. Let me just put it that way. But those words, they had like a patent. Let me put it that way for those words. Those were their tongues. it became interesting when like one of the people in the choir, because again, remember we were all in the choir, all the children who joined the church were in the choir, including babies who could not even blow their own nose. Like babies who couldn't even like do that were in the choir. Okay, all the kids were in the choir. Now I'll tell you why, because this is crazy. So it became a point where one of the ladies in the choir would also go into a trance, but she would be speaking all the tongues of the other people. So everybody used to be like, okay, are you all sharing the spirit? Because there was also like the sense of like someone has the spirit of Moses, this other girl has the spirit of Elijah. And so she's like a fiery spirit. So when she sees a vision, there's like a stamp of approval on it, that sort of thing. It was that vibe. I'm exhausted just thinking about it. I need a cup. I need a sip of tea. Okay. Yeah. So it was that vibe. And yeah, so there was a lot of reverence for this. Obviously, the pastor's daughter is like, yeah, she went to school, she got 3 witches. I can't remember the story, but what I remember, which might be wrong because I don't trust my memory on this one, was that she had gone to school and these kids had offered her like biscuits. Now, if you grew up in Nigeria around the time I did, I'm pretty sure you remember how our parents used to be like, don't take anything from anybody, don't share food with anybody, don't eat whatever they give you because they might be trying to initiate you into some sort of witchcraft. So this pastor's daughter had been offered something at school and she said no to these girls. And when the girls got into class, they all fell asleep. So all the girls who ate that thing fell asleep. And so she recognized, because I have to make sure I'm putting this in quote, that they had traveled in the spirit to an evil meeting where they were meeting with other witches. So she reported them to the school authorities. And when the school authorities obviously started to torture these kids, like calling them witches, the kids were like, yeah, we're witches. Because what else are you going to do? Nobody's going to believe that you're not anyway, so you might as well admit it. But that was that story. So that was happening. We were still believing in the promised land. And it was just an interesting thing. We were also fighting against the Babalawo cult that happened to hold their meetings sometimes on Friday nights around the same time that we were praying. So there was that. I think an interesting thing I remember from this church was a blind man came once and he started to see in the church. I don't know if that miracle was true. I don't know. Okay? But I'll tell you why I had my doubts. So this man came to the service. It was a vigil service. We were all there. And the story was that this man couldn't see. He was blind and all that. And the pastor was going to do a miracle that was similar to what Jesus did when he spat on the man's eyes. And the man was like, I see men, but they look like trees, that sort of thing. And he did that. And he had a lot of clapping and jumping and whatever. And eventually this man said he could see. I say that this might have been staged because I remember that around that time, the vision this pastor had seemed to be consuming everything that he was doing. So again, just give you some background on this pastor, Pastor A. He was very knowledgeable about the Bible. Like he could memorize Bible, not verses, chapters. And he would recite them in the middle of prayer. Like we could be praying for protection and this man would just start to recite Ezekiel 37, just off by heart, from beginning to the end. And obviously my dad was impressed by that. I don't know why, but he was impressed by that. So he would recite Bible passages in the middle of prayer. He instituted something that was called 1 hour with Christ, which was we have 1 hour every service besides our normal prayer where we're just praying to God. Like we're just there praying for 1 hour. And I remember we got into the car one day and my sister said to my dad, why is this happening? Like, I don't have anything to say for 1 hour. And my dad said, oh, you thank God for 20 minutes. And my sister was like, okay, I don't have that much to say. But there was that. There was also like at the beginning of every prayer, we would start by reciting the name of Jesus. Like for like 5 minutes, we're just like, Jesus Christ, Jesus Christ. I'm laughing, but this was all very serious, okay? This was all very serious. And I'm not saying any of these things were bad. But where I started to find things funny with this pastor, obviously I was a child, so I didn't have any opinions, but it just started to get a bit boring, was that my younger brother and I had to spend a day with the pastor and his family because our parents were going out of town and my elder sister was at university. So we go to this pastor's house. I had just learned how to bake cakes then. So I said, oh, I was going to bake a cake for everybody. And I made a cake. Like, I brought all the ingredients. My parents gave me money. So I bought all the ingredients. I mixed the cake in their house. I made it. I served it to everybody. But before I served everybody, obviously, you honor the pastor. So I cut a big piece. I took it to his office. And he took a tiny pinch from the cake, ate it. I was like, oh, thank you. I don't want any more. Then I went back and I offered it to all his kids. And they were like, no, they don't want cake. Interesting thing is, his daughter, the one who was catching witches in school, was like my friend because she and I were in the same age group. She also didn't want cake. So my younger brother and I, sorry, I keep hitting my mic. I hope that's not transmitting across. My younger brother and I ended up eating a whole cake by ourselves before our parents came back. When our parents got there, he called my parents into a room and said, there is a spirit behind cakes and it's an evil spirit, and Demi has it because she's baked a cake. I was a child who was interested in cakes because I just liked the idea of putting things together and creating something else. But I was tagged as a child who might have an evil spirit. Okay? And yeah, I mean, my mom was like, God forbid, whatever, but religion is an interesting thing. So anyway, that was his take. So for me, it just sort of like made me feel a bit weird, like, okay, something creepy is going on here. Anywho, after a while of being in that place where the church was, and I'm sorry, I know I'm not telling this story properly, but that was when I started to question things. But also I realized, let me just say it this way, I realized that the pastor was becoming more and more ambitious. Like, there were visions that were beginning to come out saying that people must not leave the church because if they leave, they will die. And that all the children in the choir are protected because they are in the choir. Should they leave the choir, something bad would happen to them. That's why I said there was something interesting about putting all the children in the choir. It was a way to plant the parents so that they would never leave. Because if someone threatens you, that something, as a parent, I believe if someone threatens you and says something might happen to you, like you can see things are not looking right. So someone's like, well, if you leave, even though things are not looking right, something bad might happen to you. You might still risk it. But when they say something bad will happen to your kids, the story is different. So that was what was said, that if you take your kids out of this church, something bad is going to happen to them. They will die. And all the kids should be in the choir because that's what the banner of protection is. So we were all there. Anyway, in the midst of that, I ended up living in Nigeria. So I was not really intimate with the drama. But I remember that they ended up moving from where they were to a new house. That house was built for them by church members. And not all the church members, very few church members, came together, bought a piece of land, and built them a house. This was their first proper house. This church member had also bought enough land such that they could have the church outside with canopies set up. I can't remember what you'd call it in a more universal term, but it's basically like a tent, right, that's set up outside. So they could have the church under there, as opposed to people being in their house. So this was built and it was supposed to be a surprise. It was a gift. It was actually a surprise. It was a gift to the pastor and his wife. And once they received that house, they would not allow the people who built the house for them into the house. They started to act hostile towards those people. And when I think back on it, I think that to them, they felt like this is not good enough for them. Like, it was a house that they owned. The house was given to them. Basically, you didn't have to worry about anything. And listen, in Nigeria, you build a house, you're not paying annual property taxes or anything like that. It's yours. You've bought the land, you have the papers, it's yours. So they had this lovely space and house, and there was space in front. If they decided to build anything else, there was space in front. But they were very hostile to the people who had built them this house. And again, the pastor's ambition was very like, it was growing, and so visions kept coming out like, don't leave the church. If you leave, you're going to die. If you take your children out, they're going to die. If you do anything against the church, you're going to die. Like, it became like there were all these visions around judgment and all of that drama. And again, we were still on an Israelite journey, please, because don't forget that we were still on an Israelite journey, and we had not yet reached the promised land, and this was something we were working towards, and we had been chosen. And there were also all these visions that would come out in the middle of like a service where it's like, you didn't praise God enough today. So in the ranking in heaven of churches, you are at number 3. And they would mention like very popular churches in Nigeria. Then they'd be like, those churches are now like number 1 and 2 in front of the angels. So if you want to up your rank, you need to clap harder, pray harder. So we would clap for, I'm not kidding, sometimes it felt like an hour, just clapping. You'd clap until your palms were sore. Like, people would clap and like they would be vibrating. I'm not kidding. I wish I was making this up, but I am not. People would be vibrating because it was like, we want this church to be number 1 in front of the angels. It was, I mean, when you're thinking about it, looking back, it was manic. But in that moment, it seemed like we are together, we are a chosen people, we are a family, we are building something, and we are pleasing God. Okay? And we don't want to upset God ever. So obviously you were not asking any questions. You were not doing anything that would seem dodge. So yeah, there was that. There was that was going on. So they moved into this new house. They were very hostile to the people who built it. There was a woman whose husband was very wealthy. Well, I don't want to say very wealthy. He was wealthy for the time. Who started coming to the church, and they sort of like started to build closer relationships with her. She had 1 child, so they started to call her the mother of all children, so she wouldn't feel childless. I don't know what that meant, but anyway, there was that was going on during that time. And then they started to become hostile towards like church members who wanted to advance their lives. So I remember a particular story. Actually, I'll tell you 2 sub stories of the story. There was a man in the church. His kids lived overseas in the UK, I think. And this man was old. Like, he had gotten really old. And I guess his kids were like, you know what, you can come and spend some time with us. So they were able to like get him a visa. And back then, like, getting a visa for some reason was really, well, in my eyes, it looked really difficult. And I think it's still difficult for a lot of Nigerians. So they were able to get him a visa to go out, and he went out there. And I remember, because I wasn't living in Nigeria anymore, but my parents were still going to this church, and my siblings, like when my sister was home, she would still go to this church. So she was telling me these stories, and my mom as well, that when this man traveled and he had been gone for a bit, I recall someone telling me, I can't remember who, that Pastor A called for all the congregation to pray for this man to come back home so that he would not forget the church. And I've just said that in the most diplomatic way I can put it. He was basically praying that this man would get deported so that he would not forget the church. Yeah, that's not a lie. The other story is actually a funny one. There was a family that we were close to. I'm going to call them the AD family. So the AD family had 4 sons, and yeah, like 4 strapping boys and all that. They were also in the church. Again, their sons were with us in the choir, because we were all in the choir, y'all. Whether or not you could sing, like, you can hear my voice. I am not a singer. I can probably read you a story, but I'm not a singer. But we're all there. And we noticed after a while that the family, like the whole family, would not come to church. Like, sometimes it would be the mother and 2 sons, and sometimes it would be the father and 2 sons. Like, and it wasn't always the same 2 sons. Like, the mother would come with the youngest 2 sons, and the father would go with the older 2. Like, so it was very split. So it seemed like there were signs that they were leaving. Interestingly, a vision came out. I remember this was during a weekday service, and I happened to be at home. A vision came out, and the vision was that, oh, if they leave the church, they will die. Something bad will happen to them, so they must never leave. The woman was the one in the church, and she happened to be there by herself that day. Her family wasn't there. And I remember she knelt immediately in front of the prophet or prophetess in the trance, and was like, I would never ever leave. I would never do that. This is my home. I would never leave. That was the last day we saw Mrs. AD. She never came back, and she was well, because when we checked on her, she was doing great. She and her kids were doing great. So I think that was when the veil started to fall, like, or should I say the scales started to fall off our family's eyes. Like, first of all, it was this prayer against people, and then they sort of became hostile towards my mom, because my mom was doing really well and she was happy to like pay for things. But my mom's not a pushover. Like, if she's not happy with something, she will tell you that, listen, this seems a bit odd. And I think she had spoken up about something. So they were beginning to launch prayers in the service against her. And people would pray. But what made it interesting about the people in the trance and the prophet seeing the visions was there was one day, I can't remember who told me this, one of them wanted to say something to my mom. She was in a trance. And the idea of you being in a trance is that you are in a spiritual realm so you can see everything that we can't, including knowing people's names. So then she comes out and she's like, I have a vision for this woman who sits here, but I don't know her name. And you're in a trance. And my mom's like, how is this working? Because it's not adding up. A and B are not leading up to C. 1 plus 1 is not 2. It's telling me it's 11. Something is not right here. So eventually, my parents left the church. And I think for a long time after they left the church, because there's something about being in that kind of environment, which I'm very convinced was leading up to a cult, because there's so many other things that happened that I just don't want to say on camera because they were really bad. But things like that where it's leading up to a cult, being in such an environment, when you leave, for some people, they still look for a similar environment. They look for a place where it's like, oh, like where is like something similar happening. So that's a whole different story. But having told you all of these things, one thing I want to point out, or the things I wanted to point out, is that how you know that you're in a religious cult often starts with the brand, like the person in charge trying to create a brand. Like Pastor A was trying to create a brand, and he obviously became frustrated when that brand wasn't coming together as quickly as he had expected it to. So he had expected that the moment he had shared that vision of the promised land and all of these things, that people would make them happen. Because typically that's what happens in Nigeria. Pastors would come up and say, the Lord has given me a vision, for example, that I should drive a private jet. And then they would run an offering for people to donate for the private jet. Or you would have like wealthy people who are like, oh, I really need something from God, so I'm going to donate some money. Or they have all these calls where it's like, if you want a blessing from God, come and donate money. When pastors are very focused on building a brand, I'm like, you're heading down towards a cult. Like, you're heading towards a cult. When a pastor starts to demand subservience from you, like where it's like whatever I say is what you do and what you believe, you are in a cult. You can't ask questions. You can't question. Because the moment my mom was like, oh, this is a bit odd. And I'll tell you a background story to that. So there was the pastor and his wife, Pastor A and Mrs. A. I'm just going to call them that. Mrs. A had a younger sister who lived with them, with the pastor's family. Now, this younger sister was getting married, and I think it was like a few days before the wedding. The wedding was going to be at the church. At that time, we were at the house where the Babalawo people were across the road or whatever, doing their own shindig every Friday. So she was going to get married, and a few days before, I think my mom had called and said, what are the plans for this wedding? Like, who's the caterer? Who's baking the cake? Because my mom's like, I mean, like, why not, right? And they were like, we don't have plans. People are going to drink sachet water. So if you don't know sachet water, it's called pure water in Nigeria. This is like bags of water, basically plastic bags of water. Just hand it out to people. And they would eat like biscuits and stuff, and that should be fine. And my mom was like, why would that be the wedding? Because I don't know if you've seen a Nigerian wedding. There's always food. Okay, like I'm not even trying to say it's always glamorous, because it's not always that. That's like class still plays into Nigerian society, but there's always food. There will always be jollof rice. It might not be great jollof, but there will be jollof. So my mom's like, how is there no jollof at this party? There's no meat, there's nothing. So she sponsored the cooking for this wedding. And like she did the bride's makeup, which the bride came out looking, I don't know, she looked interesting. I just wait there. Mommy, please, I know you watch this, but like that was interesting makeup. She did the bride's makeup, and yeah, they were upset with her for that. So it was that kind of environment where it was like you can't do something that is better than the pastors or does not obey the pastor's beliefs, thoughts, whatever it is that he's thinking. The thing with the cake, again, it was that sense of like there was a time when they were saying that a lot of the girls in the church, like the young children, had evil spirits. And in my mind, till this day, I believe that it affected how some parents related with their kids in the church, because it made them force the kids into the church even more, because you're scared, right? Like if someone says your child's got an evil spirit, but by coming to this church, being in the choir, they will be protected and nothing will happen to them, then parents are like, yeah, you must go. So you didn't have a situation where kids could just be like, I'm not feeling well, I can't go to church today. You didn't have that. Like, as long as you were awake and alive, you had to go to church. Now, were there good things that happened at this church? Yeah, there were. Like, I would say that there were things that I prayed for that happened. I remember there was a time when I went to church and I had like a bad case of diarrhea, which again, you should question why I was in church. But anyway, I went. And I remember going into like one of the rooms, and there was like one of these trans people sitting there, and she prayed for me and it stopped. Whether my body was the one who was like, yeah, we're done now, or it was prayer, but I do feel like the prayer worked. So there was that. So there were good things that happened in this church. It wasn't all bad. Like, and again, I think those things were the things that sort of kept a lot of people just hooked and believing in whatever it is that this pastor was saying. I don't know what became of the church. The pastor is now passed away, Pastor A. I don't think he ever achieved the vision of what he wanted to achieve. I know he felt frustrated because of that. And I believe that that's why some of those visions started to come up, where it was like, don't ever leave the church. Don't take your children out of the church. And there were like all these things about the promised land and how we're not praying enough, and how if we clap harder and whatever would be the best. And so it was that sense of like, you need to work really hard in order to earn God's favor. So there was all that. But I just wanted to say, like, I think some of the key things I'm trying to bring out here is that when you are in a cult, a lot of the time you don't know. And one of the things that tend to like keep people in a cult is they believe that they know something that other people don't. And that's a way that they keep you in. Like for us, for example, we believed that we understood all of the secrets of the world, because there were all these visions that were always flying around. And there were all these things about how we know how churches are ranked in heaven, which is a weird thing if you think about it. But that's something we were being told. And it was like, yeah, like because you work hard, because you do this. So, and that, like, so you become ranked according to the label that you put in. And I will not explain how that impacted me personally in terms of like how I approached work and the things that I was doing, but that's a whole different story. But yeah, there was that. So sometimes the sense of like you're doing something, you know something other people don't, will keep you in a cult. And I guess what I'm trying to tell people is that if you are in a situation, it might not be TB Joshua level, right? Nobody is sexually molesting you or doing all those kinds of things. You might be in that situation where it's just like you have to be subservient, you have to obey certain rules, you have to, like, you're being kept in the place with fear. It might be time for you to step back. I grew up with this, I think, with this sense of fear, like, oh my God, if I don't do everything in a certain way, God's going to judge me and that will be the end of it. But as I grew older, obviously away from home, forming my own ideas, my own thoughts, my belief started to change and my relationship with God started to change completely. It's no longer fear-based. I'm not scared of making a mistake. Like, if I make a mistake, it is what it is. Like, yep. So I'm not scared of doing that. I'm not scared of like asking questions, because this is the interesting thing about cults. And I think this in particular makes Christianity as a whole a cult. Okay. the sense that you can't question anything. Why would you believe in something that you can't question? I ask questions. I get answers. And I get satisfactory answers. And I form my beliefs based on those answers. So part of the cultist movement-ish in churches is that sense of you can't question anything. There's only one person that you look up to. I remember when we used to pray in this church, we would say the God of Pastor A. It was never just God. Like there were even songs that were formed where it was like the God of Pastor A, the God of Pastor A. Because we really believed that this person was so central to our belief in God that we had to call God through his name. Obviously there was Jesus, but there's God. So just saying, like, we had a very close experience. My parents obviously left. Everything turned out great eventually. But just saying that it's easy to find a cult. It's easy to join a cult. It's easy to be roped into a cult, especially if you're desperate in a desperate situation. And if someone is charismatic enough and doing the things that you think make them a good Christian. So someone could be there like, oh, I can recite the whole Bible off by heart. And you're like, damn. And that makes you want to read your Bible more. And someone else is like, oh, yes, I can pray for hours. Because in this church, we would pray for hours on our feet, standing for hours and hours and hours. Like it was never ending. So yeah, there's that as well. So just saying, you all be safe out there. That is just a little bit of the story. I know Pastor A did some shady things, some of which bordered on sexual assault, and some of it was, or to be honest, it was just sexual assault. But again, the man's passed on. There's no need to name and shame. I don't think the church exists anymore, because from what I understood, before he passed on, his son also passed on. I can't remember, something happened. One of his sons passed on. Like, I don't know what happened with his wife and the whole family shindig and all that. I don't know what happened, but there was that as well. So just saying, be safe out there. If we had continued in that church, if we had stayed on believing this whole story that this person had cooked up and the staged, I really think that miracle was staged. I think that we would be in a whole different place as a family, like in a worse situation. So I'm just glad that my parents had the bravery to get up and say, we're not doing this anymore, we're getting out. And also, like, really, should I say, I really have a lot of respect for Mrs. AD and her family, who recognized something was off very quickly and also pulled their kids out, and did not care what the repercussions would be. And I think a lot of leaving a cult starts with overcoming the fear of what would happen to you after you leave the cult, because for the most part the bark is worse than the bite. Yes, I have that right. The bark is worse than the bite, and I think it's the sense of fear that they put into a lot of people that makes it seem like, oh my goodness, heaven will fall down. But there's a high chance that heaven won't fall. You'll be fine. But yeah, that's my story with a cult. And watching the TB Joshua documentary just reminded me of some of those things. So I thought I'd do this video. I've wanted to tell people this story for a long time. Yeah, I wanted to tell people this story for a long time. And I just never really got the chance to do it. But when I watched the TB Joshua thing, I thought, this is it. Don't look. I would say something. So many people are looking for a good miracle. They love a good miracle. They love the idea of, oh, I go to a church where the pastor performs miracles every Sunday. And I just want to say that a lot of the things I consider to be miracles in my life were very mundane things. Like things that when they happened, they were mundane in the sense of, like, it wasn't like, oh yeah, my leg was broken and all of a sudden the bones joined together and I was hopping around. But there were things that moved the direction of my life in ways that I could never have imagined. So the idea of, like, you need to go to this specific pastor, you need to go here, is not a thing. The idea of, like, you need to, like, have this pastor as the central point of your life in order for you to have access to God is not a thing. Okay? They're brainwashing you. They're lying to you. You don't need that pastor. You need God, period. You don't need that pastor. And I'm not saying don't go to your church. I'm just saying, based on my experience with churches, and I've just told you a bit about Pastor A's church, where there were other churches after that, where it was just like, what the hell is going on? Please, just look for God and forget all of these, forget all the drama and all the TV production they're putting out for you, okay? You don't need to donate money to get a blessing from God. That's something I strongly believe, and I will believe that every single day. That's not how God operates. The way I know God, that's not how God operates. But anyway, I'll stop it there because I don't want to go into a whole different story. You all stay safe out there. Cults are real. Pastors, some of them are parasitic. Some of them are just trying to build a brand. Some of them are trying to make their dreams come true through you coming in their church and believing whatever it is that they're telling you, which might not be anything that's helpful for you. Because think back to everything we heard about at Pastor A's church. None of it was helpful for our lives, for our development in any way. Sitting there listening to someone recite the Bible from scratch was not helpful. And all those long theological sermons where we had themes, topics that I can't remember any of them because they had no impact whatsoever. Anywho, that's the whole drama. You all have fun. I am going to enjoy my now very cold tea, and I'm drinking it this way because the heat I'm producing, telling you all the story, is way too much. All right then, see you on the next video, and goodbye.